Just a nurse. That is what Dr. Marcus Caldwell had called her yesterday, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt reserved for people he'd decided were permanently beneath him. Danielle Ross had simply nodded, documented the patient's vitals with steady hands, and continued her shift without looking at his face. She'd learned long ago that the best response to humiliation was no response at all. But that was 14 minutes before a Marine in room 347 opened his eyes and saw her face, and suddenly 2 decades collapsed into a single moment of recognition that would change everything. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells like industrial antiseptic layered over burnt coffee and something else underneath, the faint metallic tang of blood that never quite washes out of the linoleum, no matter how many times the night shift mops. Fluorescent lights hum their endless monotone over scuffed floors, and the third-floor nurse's station never stops beeping. Monitor alarms. Call buttons. Text alerts. The constant percussion of a hospital that never truly sleeps. Danielle had been walking these corridors for 2 years, a shadow in navy scrubs, the kind of nurse who arrived early, left late, and never volunteered opinions in the break room. Her efficiency was legendary, charting 3 times faster than anyone else, her documentation flawless, her patient assessment so thorough that residents had started asking her for second opinions when they thought no one was looking. Her locker was the second one from the bathroom on the 3rd floor. Inside, a spare pair of shoes, a protein bar she never ate, and a tarnished military challenge coin she touched once each shift before closing the metal door. The coin was the color of oxidized copper, worn smooth on the edges from thousands of touches across 2 decades. No one had ever asked her about it. The hospital didn't ask questions about its nurses' personal habits, not as long as the work got done, not as long as they stayed invisible. This morning, like every morning, Danielle had clocked in at 5:06 and reviewed her patient assignments. 12 beds. 3 post-surgical. 2 chronic pain management. 1 diabetic in crisis. And room 347, a 27-year-old Marine named Tyler Matthews, admitted 3 days ago after a training accident at Fort Stewart. Training accident. That was the clinical term. Danielle had read his file with the careful attention she gave to everything: compound fracture of the left tibia, soft tissue trauma, concussion, minor respiratory contusion. He was stable. Healing on schedule. She would change his dressing, check his line, monitor his pain levels, and move to the next room. That was the job. She pushed open the door to 347 at 0730, her badge swinging against her ribs with a soft metallic clink. The morning light was already hot through the window, turning the room into a box of amber. Tyler was asleep, his jaw tight even in unconsciousness, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of someone still carrying pain in his dreams. His left leg was elevated, wrapped in surgical dressing that needed checking. Danielle moved to his bedside with a quiet precision that had become her signature, the movements of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, the grace of muscle memory that transcended context. She was reaching for his chart when his eyes snapped open. Not gradually. Not the slow blink of someone waking from sleep. His eyes opened like shutters, pupils wide and tracking, focused on her face with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. His body went rigid. His right hand moved toward the call button, then stopped. Danielle felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, like standing in front of a searchlight. His voice came out rough, fractured. "That's you." Danielle continued her work. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She'd been trained in crisis management before she learned to read, trained to maintain composure when everything around her was fracturing. She checked his full line. She noted the dressing condition. She documented vitals on the chart with her pen moving in steady, precise strokes. "Your vitals are good, Marine," she said, her voice even. Clinical. The voice she used with all her patients. "Pain level." He didn't answer. He was still staring at her face like he was trying to solve an equation written in her features. His heartbeat accelerated, she could see it on the monitor, the spike from 68 to 82, the digital numbers climbing as his pupils dilated. Fight or flight response. Adrenaline dump. She'd seen it 1,000 times in trauma patients, in surgical recoveries, in people whose bodies remembered danger their minds couldn't quite articulate. Marine. Pain level. 1 to 10. You pulled me out, he said. The words came out raw. In Bagram. You pulled me out of the school. I was 7. Everyone was dead and the dust was so thick I couldn't. His voice broke. Your eyes. I never forgot your eyes. Danielle's pen didn't stop moving. Her heart rate remained exactly where it had been. She was trained to compartmentalize with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, trained to separate the woman she had been from the woman she had to be. The person standing in this hospital room was a nurse named Danielle Ross, hired 2 years ago by Human Resources, with credentials that checked every box and a background so clean it gleamed. She had no history before Cedar Creek. No past. No shadows. That was the agreement. That was the cost of disappearing. Pain level, she said again. 6. No, 4. How are you here? She noted it. 4 out of 10. She was turning to leave, her job for this patient complete, when the monitor behind her spiked again, not Tyler's monitor, but the one from down the hall, in the cafeteria break room. Danielle had 3 seconds of blessed separation before the shift changed over and Dr. Caldwell arrived for morning rounds. She made it to the cafeteria at 0800 exactly, that precise moment when the breakfast service was ending and the lunch prep hadn't begun. The space was empty except for 2 residents hunched over coffee and files, studying for boards. Danielle carried her tray, egg whites, toast, black coffee, to an isolated table where no one would bother her. She ate mechanically, the way she did everything. Fuel. Nothing more. Dr. Caldwell walked in at 0813 with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, his white coat pristine, his posture the architecture of privilege. He was mid-conversation with 2 junior residents, his voice the kind of rich that came from old money and better schools, the tone of a man who'd never once worried about consequences. So I told her, triple load this week. Let's see how long before she cracks. He was laughing. His residents laughed with him, that obligatory sound of people who'd learned that agreement was survival. Bet you 50 she quits within 7 days. No one's that competent unless they're looking to show off. Danielle continued eating. He was walking past her table when he fainted left, then stumbled dramatically into her tray. It wasn't an accident. Accidents were clumsy, unexpected. This was choreographed. His foot caught the table leg at precisely the right angle, his body angle to maximize impact, and suddenly eggs scattered across the floor like a crime scene. Scrambled eggs hit her scrubs, warm and sticky, dripping down her left shoe and splattering across the floor in a yellow starburst. Caldwell smirked. His residuals laughed. The eggs smelled acidic and saltsick against the antiseptic backdrop of the hospital. Oh, my apologies, sweetheart, he said, his voice dripping with theatrical regret. Clumsy of me. Danielle set down her coffee. She looked at the eggs. She looked at her shoe. She looked at him with eyes that had seen the worst things human beings could do to each other, eyes that had tracked sniper fire at 300 yards, eyes that had watched children die because she couldn't move fast enough to save them all. Her jaw clenched once. Her hand stayed steady as she stood and retrieved paper towels from the dispenser. She cleaned the eggs from her shoe with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. The resident stopped laughing. Even Caldwell's smile faltered slightly, something in her silence more unnerving than any protest would have been. I'll be back on the floor in 2 minutes, she said to no one in particular. She disposed of the paper towels, returned her plate, and walked out of the cafeteria. Her scrubs were damp. Her shoe squelched slightly against the tile floor. She could hear Caldwell's laugh resuming behind her, that sound of a man who'd never encountered resistance that didn't break. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened during afternoon rounds when she returned to room 347 and found Caldwell standing over Tyler Matthews's chart, his pen moving across the page with the arrogance of someone signing a death warrant he'd never have to live with. He'd flagged her notes. highlighted her assessments, scrawled a question mark across her vitals documentation like she was a resident who'd failed boards. "Room 347, he said without looking up. "I'm reassigning this patient to Dr. Henderson's service. These notes are sloppy, unprofessional." Her notes were immaculate. They both knew it. "Understood, Doctor," Danielle said. "Also, sweetheart," he turned to face her, still smiling that smile, still wearing the armor of someone who'd never once been held accountable. "I'll be monitoring your work more closely going forward. Quality control." She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded and stepped back, the perfect subordinate, the invisible nurse, the woman who had no voice and no past and no right to exist anywhere except in the margins of other people's narratives. But Tyler Matthews had recognized her? Tyler Matthews remembered. And somewhere in the machinery of fate, in the collision of two timelines that should have never intersected, the past was beginning to move toward the present like a helicopter on final approach, rotors cutting through the air, bringing with it the weight of everything she'd buried and the cost of everything she'd sacrificed to disappear. She could feel it coming. The way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain. The way you feel the presence of someone trained to move through darkness without making a sound. It wasn't a request. It was a countdown. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical moved like clockwork, fluorescent lights humming their relentless mechanical song, the steady beep of monitors creating a baseline rhythm beneath everything else. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood at the nurse's station with two residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark, his tailored white coat somehow managing to convey both authority and arrogance in equal measure. Danielle Ross moved through her charting without lifting her eyes from the desk, acutely aware that the countdown had already begun. "Let's make this interesting," Caldwell announced, loud enough for other nurses to stop and listen. His voice had that practiced cadence of someone used to being obeyed. "I'll bet you $20 our little ghost here quits within a week if we triple her patient load. She's got that look, doesn't she? The kind that folds under pressure." The two residents exchanged glances, nervous laughter, the kind that comes when a superior has just said something cruel and everyone is unsure whether they're allowed to find it funny. They did anyway. Danielle's jaw clenched once. A single muscular contraction, barely visible to anyone not trained to notice. She looked up from her keyboard, met Caldwell's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then nodded. No protest. No defense. Just acceptance. Her hand reached out and took the revised assignment sheet from his fingers, and as she clipped it to her board, her fingers remained perfectly steady. Not shaking. Not trembling. The kind of composure that made people uncomfortable because it suggested she was either unaffected or far more dangerous than she appeared. "Excellent," Caldwell said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. He'd expected resistance. He'd wanted resistance. The absence of it seemed to irritate him more than if she'd argued. "Room 314, 316, 318, post-op cardiac patients, all three. Room 322, dialysis setup. Room 325, medication administration at 1,400 hours. Room 347, the Marine with the training accident." He paused, watching for a reaction. "And room 329, a fresh admission from the ER. Let's see how you manage when you're actually useful." The words were designed to wound. The delivery was designed to humiliate. Neither worked. Danielle simply turned back to her keyboard and began organizing the new assignments into her shift sequence, her mind already calculating patient acuity levels, medication schedules, and vital sign frequencies. She'd worked with far worse than Caldwell. She'd worked in conditions where the sound of incoming fire meant you had 30 seconds to decide which patients to move and which to leave behind. This was just noise. Just theater. But that wasn't what bothered her. What bothered her was room 347. That afternoon in the cafeteria, Caldwell orchestrated his second move with theatrical precision. The timing was deliberate, busy enough that people were watching, quiet enough that everyone would hear. Danielle sat at a corner table picking at a salad, still wearing the white shoes now stained at the heel from the morning incident. She'd had 7 minutes between patients and hadn't stopped to change them. Caldwell approached from her blind side and performed what would have been a convincing stumble if not for the calculated way his hip connected with her tray. Scrambled eggs exploded across the table. Orange juice pooled beneath her chair, sticky and acidic. A plastic cup clattered against the tile floor. The entire cafeteria went quiet, that suspended moment where everyone stops moving, everyone stops breathing, everyone becomes a witness. "Oh, Ghost, I'm so sorry," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with false concern, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You really should watch where you sit. These things happen so easily when someone isn't paying attention." He straightened his coat and walked away, leaving the mess for someone else to handle. Danielle stood. She reached for a napkin from the dispenser at the next table and wiped her hands with methodical precision, one finger at a time, paying special attention to the spaces between her knuckles. Her face was a mask, not angry, not humiliated, just present. She tossed the napkin into the trash and returned to the kitchen, picking up another tray, another salad, another bottle of water. She was back on the floor in 4 minutes, the sticky smell of orange juice following her like a ghost through the afternoon rounds. At 1,600 hours, Caldwell made his third move. He found Danielle in the medication room, the one place in the hospital where she was most vulnerable, most alone, most expected to be compliant. He held a stack of patient charts in one hand, and with the casual cruelty of someone testing the limits of an authority he'd assumed he possessed, he dropped them at her feet. 7 manila folders scattered across the linoleum like casualties. One slid halfway under the refrigerator. Another landed spine down, the pages fanning open. "Pick those up, sweetheart," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the particular menace of a man used to being obeyed. "I need them refiled by shift change, and try not to contaminate them with whatever competence you think you have." 2 residents lingered in the doorway, close enough to see, close enough to hear, positioned exactly where they were meant to be. Danielle knelt down. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. She simply began gathering the charts, moving with unhurried efficiency, her fingers careful around the medication notations, the dosage calculations, the clinical details that mattered. Her knuckles went white around the folder edges, just for a second, just for those residents to see, and then the color returned. She stood with the stack neat and organized, her voice perfectly level. "I'll have these refiled within the hour, doctor." She continued documenting vitals on her patients as if he'd said nothing at all, her pen moving in steady blue lines across the paper, recording blood pressures and oxygen saturations with the precision of someone for whom accuracy was survival. But 30 seconds later, when Caldwell had left and the residents had drifted away, she stepped into the supply closet and braced both hands against the shelf, the one with the bandages and the sterile gauze and the things designed to repair damage. She breathed. 1, 2, 3. Steady breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The kind of controlled respiration they'd taught her in a place that officially never existed, in a role that had been erased from every official record the moment the orders came down to disappear. The kind of breathing that meant the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. But the supply closet couldn't hold her forever, and at 16:30, Danielle returned to the floor and made her way to room 347. The Marine was waiting for her. She could feel it before she opened the door, the particular quality of attention that came from someone trained to notice things, someone whose life had depended on reading rooms and reading people and reading the almost invisible signals that separated the living from the dead. His name was on the chart, Lance Corporal Marcus Webb, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, admitted 4 days ago with a traumatic closed head injury sustained during a training exercise. Stable vitals. No complications. Expected discharge in 72 hours. But his eyes tracked her the moment she entered the room. Not like a patient watches a nurse. Like a soldier watches a possibility. Like someone who had seen a face before and couldn't quite believe it was real. The other nurses had noticed. Danielle heard them talking in the break room, their voices pitched low and uncertain, something about how he was too focused on just one nurse and how it was a little strange, don't you think? Danielle had simply pulled on clean gloves and moved to the next task. "Good afternoon, Lance Corporal," she said, her tone professional, her voice the careful neutral register she used with all patients. She checked his full line, the flow rate steady at 2 milliliters per hour, the medication running clear through the tubing. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I've seen a ghost," he said quietly. His voice carried the rasp of someone still recovering, but underneath it was something else. Recognition. Certainty. Green eyes. I remember green eyes. Danielle's hand froze for half a second, the only moment where the mask slipped just enough for someone paying very close attention to see it. Then she continued the procedure, adjusting the dressing around his foresight with practiced efficiency, her movements returning to their steady mechanical precision. "You're thinking of someone else, Lance Corporal," she said, keeping her voice at exactly the same pitch as before. "I've never been overseas." But he was still watching her when she left the room. Still watching her through the glass. And in the hallway, Danielle could feel the weight of that attention like a physical thing, like something that had crossed 20 years and a hemisphere and a carefully constructed wall of silence to find her again. The next morning, Caldwell made his call. He timed it carefully, early enough that Roger Pemberton, the hospital board president, would still be in a good mood, late enough that the morning rush hadn't started. Pemberton was at the country club, Caldwell knew. Standing court near the tennis courts, the kind of man for whom the morning game was just an excuse to be seen and important and connected to other people who mattered. "Roger, we may have a liability situation," Caldwell said, his voice carrying that particular blend of concern and authority that made people listen. "A nurse with suspicious credentials forming concerning attachments to a military patient. I think we need to look deeper into her background. There are gaps. Employment gaps. Nothing documented. Behavior that's questionable." He also made calls to Danielle's nursing school references, 3 careful conversations with people who trusted Caldwell's professional judgment. He asked about emotional stability and gaps in employment history and whether they'd ever noticed concerning behavior patterns. He planted seeds of doubt like a gardener, methodical and patient, trusting that the seeds would grow in the fertile ground of institutional skepticism. The Marine told his physical therapist. He told the roommate who visited during evening hours. He told anyone who would listen, "That nurse saved my life before. I know it was her." Bagram, 2004. The school that collapsed. I was 7 years old. And in a hospital in Savannah, Georgia, the countdown continued toward something neither of them could yet see coming. The monitors in room 347 sang their usual rhythm, beep, 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 the kind of steady pulse that meant nothing was wrong, which meant everything was about to go catastrophically wrong. 1900 hours. Shift change. That liminal time when the day staff was handing off to nights and the hallways filled with the shuffle of tired nurses comparing notes on patients they were abandoning for 8 hours. Danielle was documenting vitals, her pen moving with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything: blood pressure 128/76, oxygen saturation 94% on 2 liters, heart rate 68 and regular. The Marine, Lance Corporal Webb, 27 years old, recovering from a training accident that had crushed his left tibia and left him in a hospital bed instead of a barracks, was asleep. His face had softened in sleep, the strain erased, and for a moment he looked like the 7-year-old boy again, the one who had grabbed her uniform with bloody fingers in the rubble of that collapsed school in the Jolan district. She didn't know that would be the last moment of peace she'd have. The alarm didn't scream. It wailed. The heart monitor's rhythm dissolved into the jagged lightning bolt of ventricular fibrillation, and Danielle's body moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory taking over, the kind of reflex that only came from a decade spent in places where hesitation meant body bags. She hit the code button with the heel of her hand, her thumb already reaching for the crash cart, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I need the attending surgeon, now. Room 347, VFib, patient is down." The problem was that Cedar Creek's code team was 2 floors down. A multi-vehicle collision on Route 80, 3 patients, one of them critical. The trauma team was in OR 2, their hands already inside someone else's chest, their focus already committed. The charge nurse's voice came back through the speaker, "We're tied up in trauma." You've got respiratory and pharmacy inbound, ETA 2 minutes, but I'm pulling whoever I can find from ICU. 2 minutes. Webb's lips were already turning the color of wet concrete. His oxygen saturation was plummeting, 90%, 85, 79. The monitor showed nothing but chaos, electrical activity without meaning, a heart that had stopped pumping and started fibrillating instead. Danielle's hands were already moving. She pulled the crash cart close, the metal frame clattered against the tile floor, and she opened the emergency thoracotomy tray with the kind of controlled urgency that would have looked calm to anyone who didn't understand what they were seeing. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like she was simply preparing for the attending surgeon to arrive. To anyone who knew battlefield medicine, it would have looked like the countdown to something irreversible. 70 seconds since the alarm. She grabbed the betadine bottle and painted a wide orange stripe across his left ribcage, her touch firm enough to be therapeutic, her movements the color of absolute certainty. The scent of antiseptic rose up sharp and clean, cutting through the stale hospital air like a blade through fog. She could feel the resistance building in her chest, the part of her that had been Danielle Ross, careful floor nurse, the invisible woman who accepted humiliation with a clenched jaw and a steady hand. But that person had never existed. That person was a costume, and costumes came off when lives were on the line. 85 seconds. The crash cart had everything she needed. Size 12 blade. Bovie cautery. Retractors. A sterile field that would hold for exactly as long as she needed it to. She picked up the scalpel and made the incision, lateral thoracotomy, fourth intercostal space, the knife moving through skin and muscle with the kind of economy of motion that came from having done this before, in a cave in Sanjin Valley with a headlamp and a Marine who was bleeding out faster than she could work. The blood came, not spurting, because his pressure had already collapsed, but steady and dark, flowing into the sterile field like a river finding its course. The attending surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chen, arrived at 93 seconds. She stopped in the doorway, her face doing something between shock and recognition, her eyes widening at the sight of a floor nurse performing a procedure that existed at the intersection of trauma surgery and impossibility. "What are you?" Patient was down for 90 seconds, VFib, refractory to single shock, Danielle said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. She had the ribs spread now, the retractors holding the chest cavity open, and there was the heart, pale and quivering uselessly. No attending available. ETA on surgical team. 5 minutes. Maybe 6. Chen moved closer, her hands already reaching for gloves. What's his baseline? Good cardiac history. 27. No prior events. Danielle's hands disappeared into the cavity, her fingers finding the apex of the heart, and she began the compressions, 2 fingers, 60-degree angle, pushing the heart against the spine, manually forcing it to beat. Apex supported, 2-finger technique, rate 120. His perfusing. Look at his color. The heart in her hands was the size of a clenched fist, and it should have been impossible for something so small to hold a life. But Webb's lips were already losing their concrete color, shifting back toward flesh tone, oxygen finally reaching his brain again. The monitor showed the steady blip of sinus rhythm emerging from the chaos like land appearing from fog. "You've trained on this," Chen said. Not a question. An observation from someone who recognized the signature of expertise, the kind of knowing that only came from having saved lives before. "Yes," Danielle said. She didn't elaborate. Elaboration would have required answers she wasn't permitted to give. 120 compressions. I can maintain this. Prep for surgical washout. Chen worked the code like a musician, calling orders that rippled through the ICU, epi-push, 1 milligram, betadine for the field, prepare for sternal saw once we get upstairs, get me ONEG and a type and cross. But her eyes kept returning to Danielle's hands, to the way the rhythm stayed steady, to the absolute absence of tremor in someone performing open-chest cardiac massage on a patient in a civilian hospital, on a floor that was supposed to be staffed with nurses, not combat medics. The surgical team arrived at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. They took over the compressions with a kind of reverent care, as if they were handling something sacred, and Webb's chest traveled upstairs intact, his heart beating pink and strong, his oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal. 92%. 94. 96. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The cleanup happened in silence. Danielle disposed of the instruments, sealed the tray, documented the timeline with clinical precision: time of arrest, time of intervention, time of code end, exact sequence of events rendered in the neutral language of hospital procedure. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, not in words but in blood and muscle memory and the kind of decision-making that only came from having operated under fire. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 1932 hours. He stood in the doorway of the ICU, watching Danielle finish her documentation, watching her pull off her gloves with the same calm efficiency she applied to everything, and she saw the exact moment his face transformed. The color climbed from his neck upward, crimson, then scarlet, then a shade that approached apoplexy. His hands clenched at his sides, and his breathing changed, becoming shallow and rapid, the breathing of a man watching his authority dissolve in real time. "Step away from that desk," he said. Danielle turned to face him. Her hands were clean. Her voice was level. "Doctor, you performed surgery." His words came out clipped, controlled, each one a blade. "You performed a thoracotomy without authorization. You violated every protocol in this hospital. I want a full written explanation on my desk within the hour, and I want to know exactly where you learned to." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "No civilian nursing program teaches emergency thoracotomy. Where did you train?" "As needed," Danielle said simply. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes moving across her face as if he was trying to read something written in a language he didn't speak. And then his expression shifted, not back to normal, but into something colder, something calculated. He pulled out his phone. "I need to speak with the hospital administrator," he said, his voice quiet now, more dangerous. "This is a matter of credential fraud and unauthorized practice of medicine." Within 20 minutes, he had called the board president, the licensing division, and the state nursing board. Within an hour, he had contacted Cedar Creek's legal department, his voice steady now, professional, laced with the kind of righteous concern that only a man with nothing to hide could muster. "I have serious questions about this employee's background. Her performance today suggests training that goes well beyond standard nursing education. I want an external investigation into her credentials and her history." Danielle finished her shift. She charted the rest of her patients with the same precision she brought to everything. She didn't look at Caldwell again. She didn't respond to the whispers that were already beginning to move through the hospital like wildfire: the floor nurse who had performed emergency surgery, the sudden arrival of administrative interest, the smell of a scandal about to detonate. She moved through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical like a ghost, visible but untouched, and when she reached her locker at the end of the night, she pulled out the tarnished military challenge coin and held it in the palm of her hand. The metal was worn smooth from 20 years of being carried in scrub pockets, moved from locker to locker, kept close through a decade of building a life that had never really been hers. The insignia on its face had been struck from the fuselage of a Black Hawk that had gone down over Helmand Province in 2004. The unit that had given it to her officially didn't exist. But it would exist in exactly 23 hours, whether she was ready or not. Dr. Caldwell's fingers moved across his phone before the code team had even finished compressing Webb's chest. He stood at the nurse's station with the casual precision of a man activating a network he'd spent years building, each call a thread in a web that had protected mediocrity from exposure for longer than most careers lasted. The hospital board president was on the tennis court in Forsyth Park when Caldwell reached him. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. By evening, the message had reached Danielle's nursing school references in Louisville, each one fielding the same vague, poisoned question: "We're just trying to understand some concerns that have surfaced about her stability during her clinical rotations." Nothing formal yet, but her name came up. The words were careful, plausibly deniable, devastatingly effective. An outside consultant arrived Wednesday morning, a credentials investigator named Patricia Hess who worked for 3 hospital systems across Georgia and had never once sided against an attending physician in 14 years of practice. Caldwell met with her in the administrative conference room before she'd even unpacked her briefcase. He was smooth, professional, deeply concerned. The procedure she performed was clearly beyond her scope. Open cardiac massage. Bilateral finger thoracostomy. She knew exactly what she was doing, which raises the question of where she learned it. Hess took notes, her pen moving in steady lines. And her background check. 2-year gap during her RN certification. Unaccounted for. References report instability. Behavioral concerns. He slid a folder across the glass table. I have documentation. He didn't. But the consultant didn't need it, she needed permission to investigate, and permission was exactly what Caldwell had given her. The process moved like a machine with well-oiled parts. By Wednesday afternoon, Hess had contacted the licensing board, flagged Danielle's name in the state database, and requested a full personnel file audit. By Thursday morning, she'd interviewed 3 nurses who admitted, when asked the right leading questions, that Danielle seemed unusually guarded and potentially withholding information about her background. By Thursday afternoon, she'd prepared her preliminary report, unauthorized performance of advanced surgical procedures without documented training, potential falsification of credentials, behavioral red flags suggesting possible psychological instability, patient boundary violations during the Webb case. The suspension came at 18:47 on Thursday. Danielle was escorted from the floor by hospital security before her shift officially ended, her badge deactivated mid-stride, her locker cleaned out by a supervisor who handed her belongings in a white plastic bag as if the contents had become radioactive. Her personnel file was stamped in red, suspended pending termination. Investigation active. Do not rehire without board approval. The accusations were specific enough to seem credible, vague enough to be impossible to defend without explaining things she was not permitted to explain. A 2-year gap she couldn't fill. References she couldn't contact. Training she couldn't document. Skills she couldn't account for without breaking the silence that had been ordered into her file by the Joint Chiefs of Staff themselves. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She signed the paperwork without reading it, her face as blank as a closed door, and walked to the parking lot with security flanking her like she was a risk. The evening sky over Savannah was the color of rust. The air hung thick and electric, the kind of humid that made every breath feel like drowning. Danielle drove back to Cedar Creek Medical at 2,115 hours through the service entrance that the night shift used, carrying her scrubs in a brown paper bag like she was bringing them home to wash. The laundry room was empty except for Marcus, the night attendant who'd worked there for 6 years and had always been kind to her, who understood without being told that seeing her face would cost him something. He looked away when she entered. He kept looking away as she moved to the folding station. The navy blue cotton was still damp from the last wash cycle. Danielle picked up her set, the one with the small coffee stain near the right pocket that she'd never quite gotten out, the one that held the shape of her shoulders in its weave, and began to fold. The fabric was soft from 1,000 washings, thin enough that light showed through it if you held it up, worn in places where her hands had gripped railings during 14-hour shifts. She smoothed the first crease with methodical precision, the way her hands had once smoothed the chest of a 7-year-old Marine in a collapsed school in Jolin District while gunfire stitched patterns in the concrete around them. The scrubs folded into rectangles, then smaller rectangles, each crease deliberate and clean. The cotton smelled of bleach and antiseptic and failure, the failure of 2 years spent trying to disappear, the failure of a single moment of exposure, the failure of thinking that a tarnished coin in a locker could stay buried forever. Her hands moved through the motions without instruction from her brain. Fold. Crease. Stack. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical song, the same lights that had illuminated her during 217 shifts, the same frequency that had become the soundtrack to her exile. Marcus had turned away at the far end of the laundry room, his shoulders tense with the weight of pretending not to see her. The night shift hummed on without her. Someone else was managing the medication cart. Someone else was answering call lights. Someone else was being the invisible nurse who kept the machine running. She placed the folded scrubs on the counter and reached into her pocket where the tarnished challenge coin sat like a stone. The coin was made from shrapnel and aircraft wreckage, bent into a circle by hand she would never identify, engraved with call signs that officially never existed. She touched it once, just once, the metal cold against her fingertips, and then she released it. Left it in her pocket where it belonged. The coin would leave Cedar Creek Medical with her, back to an apartment 3 miles away where it would sit on a table next to a phone that hadn't rung in 2 years, waiting for a call that was only supposed to come if she broke protocol. But the protocol had already been broken. The coin had already been pulled from its hiding place by a 7-year-old memory with a Marine's uniform and a grateful cry of recognition. She turned and walked toward the loading dock without looking back at Marcus, whose face was still turned away, whose silence was a kindness she didn't deserve. The parking lot was empty at 2,247 hours except for her vehicle, a gray Honda Accord with Virginia plates that she'd bought when she first arrived in Savannah, anonymous and practical and exactly the kind of car you don't notice. She sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes without turning the key. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with enough pressure to make the knuckles white, the tendon standing out like rope beneath skin that had been scarred by things she was not permitted to discuss. The silence of the car was complete. Her breathing was controlled. Her face showed nothing. And then the dam cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. 3 tears ran down her left cheek in quick succession, the only moisture her body would permit itself, and then her composure reasserted itself like a door slamming shut. She reached into her pocket and felt the coin there, solid and real and impossible to explain, and she turned the ignition key. The engine turned over. The headlights illuminated the empty service road. And Danielle Ross, Master Chief Petty Officer, Nurse, Ghost, and the woman who had carried a child through gunfire in another country 20 years ago, drove out of the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot knowing that her silence had finally failed her. The loading dock doors closed behind her. The laundry room lights buzzed on in their empty space. And in room 347, Lance Corporal Webb asked the night nurse for the 4th time if anyone knew where the woman with green eyes had gone, his voice small and uncertain in the darkness. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would arrive in convoys and helicopters, in the voices of men who had orders older than most marriages, and in the consequence that Dr. Caldwell had never imagined possible, that the woman he'd tried to erase had been so thoroughly erased by her own government that making her disappear again would require the kind of authorization that only came from people who didn't exist. The 3 Hums rolled through the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot at 2:53 p.m., their tires silent on the fresh asphalt while afternoon traffic stopped dead. Doctors paused mid-hallway. Nurses looked up from charts. The lobby turned into something between a hospital and a war room the moment the rotor blades began turning on the helipad above, each rotation cutting the humid Savannah air like a knife through silk. Nobody needed to be told this wasn't a routine transport. Security guard Thompson, Vietnam vet, 23 years on the force, watched the lead Humvee doors open with the precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times. The colonel who stepped out wore a face like carved granite, dress blues crisp enough to cut paper, and eyes that had seen things that didn't exist in official reports. He moved through the lobby with the kind of authority that made the hospital feel suddenly very small, very civilian, very unprepared for what was about to happen. "I'm looking for Master Chief Petty Officer Ross," the colonel said. Not a request. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a voice like a tank idling in a garage. "Where is she?" The chief of surgery materialized from the administrative wing, pale and confused. "Sir, I don't think we have anyone by that." Thompson stepped forward, his security badge catching the fluorescent light. He'd served with men who moved like this colonel moved. He understood the language being spoken. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Ross, sir. She's been suspended." The lobby went absolutely silent. The colonel's jaw didn't move. His eyes just shifted, a micro-adjustment that seemed to recalibrate something in his brain. Then he turned to one of his staff officers, a captain with shoulders wide enough to carry ammunition boxes, and nodded. "Get her file. Now." What happened next would have taken 30 seconds in any other context. In Cedar Creek Medical's lobby, it stretched like hours. The captain returned with a folder so thick it looked like it could stop bullets, and the colonel opened it with hands that didn't shake, didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission from anyone. Danielle Marie Ross, he began, his voice filling the lobby like a funeral bell. Enlisted November 2003. Graduated BUD-SES training March 2005. His eyes moved down the page. News cameras were already set up, someone had called them the moment the helicopters landed, and now for reporters stood in the corners of the lobby, cameras rolling, capturing whatever this was. 3 silver stars. The hospital staff didn't move. Didn't breathe. A Navy Cross. He turned the page carefully. 17 confirmed hostile eliminations while protecting civilian evacuation operations across 3 provinces. The colonel's voice never wavered. She was part of an operation so classified that her erasure from active service records was an act of national security. There is no official record of her work. No official record of her existence. She ceased to exist at the directive of 3 branch commanders, 2 Pentagon liaisons, and someone in this hospital tried to finish what her government started. Dr. Caldwell stood at the edge of the crowd, his face already beginning to change colors, like a mood ring powered by pure panic. His phone was in his hand. It was dead. It would stay dead. The glass doors to the trauma ward opened. Lance Corporal Webb stood there in his dress uniform, still moving carefully. The cardiac damage was still visible in the way his left side held itself stiff, protected, guarded, but his uniform was perfect, his bearing was perfect, and his eyes were locked on the colonel with the focus of someone who'd been drilled into this moment 1,000 times in the last 6 months. "Sir," Webb said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through water. "I need to speak." The colonel stepped back. "Let him have the room." 20 years ago, I was 7 years old in Bagram, Webb continued, his words reaching every corner of the lobby because they'd been written for every corner of the lobby. My school collapsed. There was gunfire. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And a woman with green eyes carried me through smoke and bullets to a helicopter that shouldn't have been there. She told me I was going to be okay. That woman was Master Chief Ross. I know because I've carried her image in my head for 2 decades and watched her fold scrubs in this hospital while a man, and here he turned to Caldwell, and his voice became something that made 3 residents cry without understanding why, while a man told her she was just a nurse. The room stayed frozen. "She's the reason I'm alive," Webb said. "The reason I'm standing here. The reason that Dr. Caldwell is about to understand what consequences actually look like." The colonel moved then with the smoothness of someone executing a plan that had been developed over weeks, signed off by people in offices that didn't appear on organizational charts. He turned to Dr. Caldwell and pulled out a second file, thinner but somehow heavier. "Dr. Marcus Caldwell," the colonel began, and every word fell like a judge's gavel. "You knowingly filed false reports against a decorated service member under federal protection. You interfered with her medical practice. You fabricated accusations about credentials you couldn't access because they exist at clearance levels above your understanding." The colonel's eyes were absolutely flat. "Your medical license is under federal review. Every conversation you had with hospital administrators has been reviewed. Every email you sent has been documented. Every reference you contaminated has been contacted and informed of your actions." The hospital CEO stepped forward, his own face gone pale. His voice was steady anyway. "Dr. Caldwell, you're terminated. Effective immediately. Security." 2 uniformed officers appeared, the ones Thompson had clearly called before the helicopters landed, and they moved toward Caldwell with the fluid precision of men who'd done this before. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like something dying in the sun. "This is a civilian hospital," he managed. "You have no authority." "Wrong," the colonel said. His voice was the audio equivalent of a scalpel cutting through tissue. "I have every authority. The Pentagon has every authority. Master Chief Ross's service record exists in jurisdictions you can't even imagine. You picked a fight with someone whose government trained her to do things in the dark that would stop your heart if you knew them. He paused. Probably will anyway. The security officers cut Caldwell's badge in half with industrial scissors. The sound, a sharp, decisive snap, echoed off the tile floor like a bullet casing hitting pavement. Caldwell's phone buzzed. Then again. Then 12 more times in rapid succession as his network collapsed in real time. His wife had already seen the news. His malpractice insurance was already reviewing termination clauses. 3 hospitals had already pulled his privileges. The consultant he'd hired had already emailed the board retracting his entire report. The colonel turned back to the center of the lobby, where Danielle stood in her nurse's scrubs with her hand steady and her face absolutely composed. He saluted her, a full military salute that made every news camera capture the moment, and she returned it with the precision of someone who'd earned the right to stand in full light. "Welcome back, Master Chief," he said. One of the young residents started to clap. Then another. Then the whole lobby was clapping, not tentatively, not cautiously, but with the force of people who understood they'd just watched a woman be restored to the truth of herself. Danielle raised one hand and the applause stopped because that's what happens when someone moves with authority that can't be questioned. 6 months passed in the kind of silence that follows seismic shifts. Danielle moved back into the light. The hospital reinstated her, not as a floor nurse but as trauma coordinator and military liaison, a position they created specifically for her, with an office overlooking the helipad and commendations displayed on walls that used to hide her. She trained civilian nurses in techniques most people would never believe she knew, teaching them how to function under pressure that shouldn't be survivable, how to trust their hands when their brains were screaming to freeze. The Marine from room 347 requested permanent assignment to the base outside Savannah. He healed completely, scar tissue reformed around that newly functional heart, and he kept a photograph on his desk of 7-year-old him being carried through smoke, a reminder that some rescues take 2 decades to complete. Dr. Caldwell taught CPR to bored community college students for $14 an hour in a strip mall classroom with water-stained ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. His medical license remained under permanent review. His name became a cautionary tale, the kind of story administrators whispered about during ethics conferences, the kind of precedent that made other doctors think twice before bullying someone whose story they didn't actually know. On the evening of Danielle's formal reinstatement ceremony, she stood on the rooftop helipad at Cedar Creek Medical in dress blues so crisp they could have been issued that morning. The tarnished challenge coin was finally polished, finally pinned above her left pocket where it belonged, gold catching the last light of a Savannah sunset that painted the whole city in colors that looked like freedom. The weight of 2 years of silence lifted off her shoulders like it had been waiting for permission to leave. A young nurse approached nervously, the kind of nervousness that comes from suddenly understanding you'd been looking at a legend the whole time. "Is it true?" the nurse asked quietly. "All of it?" Danielle turned the challenge coin over in her hands, let the metal catch the light one more time, then looked at the young woman with eyes that had seen things that would never have official names. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said. The helicopter on the pad behind them fired up for a medical transport, rotor wash catching her uniform, and for the first time in 2 years, Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross stood in full light, casting a shadow that finally matched the truth of who she'd always been. Thank you for watching. If this story gave you goosebumps, please subscribe, hit that like button, and comment below. What would you have done in Danielle's position? What would you do if you discovered the quiet person next to you was carrying secrets older than most marriages?